My name is Elena Rodriguez, and 2 years ago I was stacking ammunition crates in a supply depot in Fort Carson, Colorado, at 23 years old, standing barely 5'2" and weighing 115 pounds, soaking wet. Most people saw me as just another logistics specialist who'd been assigned to the rear echelon where small women belonged, far from anything resembling real combat operations. What they didn't know was that every Saturday morning, I drove 3 hours into the Rocky Mountain wilderness to an abandoned shooting range, where my great-uncle had taught me something that would change the course of military history: preparing. And narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying this story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The fluorescent lights in Warehouse Building 47 hummed with the same monotonous drone that had become the soundtrack to my military career. I'd been assigned to inventory management for 18 months, ever since completing basic training at Fort Leonard Wood, where my drill sergeants had made it abundantly clear that my future lay in support roles rather than anything requiring physical prowess or tactical expertise. My days consisted of scanning barcodes, updating spreadsheets, and listening to male soldiers joke about how the Army was becoming a daycare center for women who couldn't handle real military work. Private Jessica Morrison worked the adjacent station, a tall blonde from Nebraska who'd also been relegated to supply duties despite scoring expert marksman during basic training. We developed an unspoken understanding born from shared frustration at watching less qualified male soldiers advance to infantry and special operations units while we organized their equipment. During our lunch breaks, she'd describe her father's hunting expeditions and her dreams of becoming a sniper, while I listened politely without mentioning my own background. The morning routine never varied. Arrive at 0600, receive assignments. From Staff Sergeant William Hayes, a career logistics specialist who treated the warehouse like his personal kingdom and female soldiers like necessary inconveniences. Hayes had made his position clear during my first week assignment. Rodriguez, I don't care what they taught you about equality in basic training. In the real Army, women handle paperwork and men handle weapons. The sooner you accept that, the easier your service will be. His words echoed similar sentiments I'd heard throughout my childhood in Pueblo, Colorado, where I'd grown up in a working-class Mexican-American family that struggled to make ends meet after my father's construction accident left him permanently disabled. My mother worked double shifts at the local hospital, while my younger brother Miguel focused on his studies, determined to become the first in our family to attend college. I'd enlisted partly to help with family finances and partly to prove that someone with my background could succeed in an institution that demanded respect regardless of circumstances. The decision to join the military had surprised everyone who knew me. At Roosevelt High School, I'd been known more for my quiet demeanor and academic achievements than any indication of warrior spirit. Teachers described me as polite and hardworking, characteristics that translated poorly to military stereotypes. About combat effectiveness, my guidance counselor had strongly encouraged me to pursue college instead of enlisting, warning that military service would be particularly challenging for someone of my size and temperament. But there were things about my background that nobody at Fort Carson understood, secrets that connected me to a legacy of precision and discipline that stretched back generations. My great-uncle Carlos Rodriguez had served as a Marine sniper during the Korean War, earning 3 Bronze Stars and a reputation for impossible shots under extreme conditions. After returning home to Colorado, he'd spent decades perfecting techniques that combined traditional Mexican hunting methods with military precision shooting. Every weekend since I was 12 years old, Uncle Carlos had driven me to his private range in the mountains, a collection of targets scattered across a valley that allowed for shooting at distances up to 1,200 meters. He'd taught me that marksmanship wasn't about strength or size, but about understanding wind, calculating trajectories, and achieving the kind of mental stillness that allowed perfect shots even under pressure. His weathered hands would guide mine as he explained breathing techniques passed down through generations of hunters who'd fed their families through precision rather than luck. "Mia," he'd say in his gravelly voice, mixing Spanish and English as he adjusted my shooting position, "the rifle doesn't care how big you are. It only cares whether you respect it enough to master the fundamentals. Size is what weak shooters worry about when they can't hit their targets." His lessons went beyond technical instruction, incorporating philosophy about patience, discipline, and the responsibility that came with deadly accuracy. The range itself had been constructed during the 1960s as a private facility for serious shooters who wanted to practice without the limitations of public ranges. Uncle Carlos had purchased the property using his military disability benefits, transforming it into a training ground that rivaled anything the military offered. Multiple shooting positions at various elevations, targets that could be adjusted for distance and wind conditions, and equipment that he'd maintained with the same attention to detail he'd learned in the Marines. By the time I graduated high school, I could consistently hit targets at 800 meters using iron sights, a skill that Uncle Carlos insisted was more valuable than any college degree. He died suddenly of a heart attack during my senior year, leaving me his collection of rifles and a notebook filled with decades of observations about wind patterns, ammunition performance, and shooting techniques that weren't taught in any military manual. The funeral had been attended by dozens of veterans who shared stories about Uncle Carlos that I'd never heard, tales of legendary shots during combat operations, and his reputation as someone who could teach marksmanship to anyone willing to learn. Several retired Marines approached me afterward, mentioning that Carlos had spoken often about his great niece who could outshoot most military snipers despite never having served a day in uniform. At the warehouse, none of my supervisors or colleagues had any knowledge of this background. My personnel file listed my military occupation specialty as 9-2, automated logistical specialist, a designation that immediately classified me as support personnel rather than combat arms. The assumption was that someone with my physical characteristics and administrative role had no business discussing weapons beyond basic maintenance procedures required for inventory management. Staff Sergeant Hayes embodied these assumptions perfectly, treating me like an intern rather than a trained soldier who'd earned the same basic qualifications as every other enlisted person. During monthly weapons cleaning sessions, he'd assign me to organize cleaning supplies while male soldiers handled the actual firearms maintenance. When new shipments of rifles arrived, I was responsible for checking serial numbers against packing lists while others conducted function testing. The irony wasn't lost on me that I spent every day surrounded by the same weapons I'd been mastering since childhood, yet nobody considered the possibility that I might know more about their capabilities than soldiers who'd received only basic training. M4 carbines, M16 rifles, and various specialized weapons passed through my hands daily as inventory items rather than tools I was qualified to use effectively. During rare conversations about combat operations, male soldiers would speak in front of me as if I were furniture, discussing deployment experiences and training exercises, while assuming that someone in logistics couldn't contribute meaningful insights. I'd listen to descriptions of marksmanship challenges that sounded elementary compared to what Uncle Carlos had taught me, but speaking up would have violated the unspoken understanding that supply personnel should focus on their assigned duties. The loneliness of this situation was compounded by the fact that other female soldiers seemed to accept their limitations as natural rather than artificial barriers imposed by institutional prejudice. Private Morrison occasionally expressed frustration about missing combat opportunities, but she'd never suggested that our current assignments were anything other than appropriate given our qualifications and physical capabilities. My living quarters reflected the same sense of disconnection that defined my military experience. The barracks room I shared with 3 other female soldiers was decorated with family photos and civilian mementos that reminded us of lives outside the military structure. My section contained pictures of Uncle Carlos in his Marine dress uniform, his rifle collection, and certificates from shooting competitions that he'd won. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, none of my roommates had ever asked about these items, perhaps assuming they were family keepsakes rather than evidence of serious marksmanship training. The rifles themselves were stored in a secure locker at the base armory, registered as personal weapons, but never mentioned in casual conversation. I'd maintained them according to Uncle Carlos's standards, but hadn't fired them since enlisting. Due to lack of access to appropriate range facilities, the contrast between my current situation and the life Uncle Carlos had envisioned for me created a constant sense of wasted potential. His notebook contained detailed instructions for advanced shooting techniques, range estimation methods, and tactical applications that went far beyond anything covered in basic military training. He'd expected me to use these skills in service to something greater than inventory management. But the military's organization seemed designed to prevent that possibility. Staff Sergeant Hayes's attitude toward female soldiers had been shaped by 20 years of service during which women were officially excluded from combat roles. Despite policy changes that theoretically opened new opportunities, his fundamental beliefs about gender roles in military operations remained unchanged. He viewed female soldiers as temporary inconveniences who would eventually leave the service to pursue civilian careers, making investment in their development unnecessary. This perspective wasn't unique to Hayes but reflected broader, institutional attitudes that created self-fulfilling prophecies about female capabilities. Women assigned to support roles rarely received opportunities to demonstrate combat-related skills, leading to assumptions that they lacked such abilities. The few who attempted to transfer to combat arms faced skepticism about their motivations and capabilities that male soldiers didn't encounter. The weekend trips to Uncle Carlos's range had become my escape from this environment, a place where I could practice skills that defined my identity more accurately than any military job description. The drive through mountain highways provided time to decompress from warehouse frustrations while anticipating hours of focused shooting. That connected me to something larger than current circumstances. The range itself remained exactly as Uncle Carlos had left it, with targets positioned at various distances and shooting positions that accommodated different tactical scenarios. I'd continued his maintenance routines, ensuring that equipment remained in perfect condition, despite my being the only person who used the facility. The silence of the mountains provided ideal conditions for concentration, allowing me to achieve levels of accuracy that would have been impossible at crowded public ranges. But these weekend escapes also highlighted the growing disconnect between my capabilities and my official role in the military. Every perfect shot at long distance reminded me that I was wasting skills that could contribute significantly to military operations, while every return to the warehouse on Monday morning reinforced the reality that institutions don't always recognize or utilize available talent effectively. The mountain air carried the scent of pine and morning frost as I pulled my Honda Civic into the gravel parking area beside Uncle Carlos's abandoned shooting range. The drive from Fort Carson had taken exactly 2 hours and 47 minutes, the same route I'd traveled every weekend for the past 18 months since beginning my assignment to warehouse duty. This Saturday morning felt different somehow, charged with an energy I couldn't quite identify as I unloaded my gear from the trunk. Uncle Carlos's workshop stood exactly as he'd left it 3 years ago, a weathered wooden structure that housed decades of accumulated knowledge about precision shooting. The key still hung from the same rusty nail behind the propane tank, hidden in a location he'd shown me when I turned 16 and started making solo trips to practice. Inside, dust motes danced through shafts of sunlight that illuminated workbenches covered with reloading equipment, ballistics charts, and notebooks filled with his distinctive handwriting. The workshop walls were lined with photographs spanning 50 years of shooting competitions, hunting expeditions, and military service. Uncle Carlos in his marine dress blues receiving commendations. Group photos from precision rifle matches where he dominated older and supposedly more experienced competitors. Images of elk and deer taken with single shots at distances that most hunters considered impossible. Each photograph told part of a story about excellence achieved through dedication rather than natural advantages. His primary rifle still rested in the custom case he'd built from Colorado pine, a Remington 700 that he'd modified extensively using techniques learned during his Marine service and refined through decades of experimentation. The weapon bore no resemblance to standard military rifles, having been customized with a match-grade barrel, precision trigger system, and optics that cost more than most soldiers earned in a month. Uncle Carlos had considered this rifle his masterpiece, a tool capable of accuracy that transcended normal limitations when handled by someone who understood its capabilities. Beside the rifle lay his shooting journal, a leather-bound notebook containing 40 years of observations about wind patterns, ammunition performance, atmospheric conditions, and the mental discipline required for consistent accuracy. Each page represented hours of careful documentation, recording every variable that could affect bullet trajectory and noting techniques that separated good shooters from legendary ones. The journal was written in a mixture of English and Spanish, with technical diagrams that illustrated concepts he'd developed through trial and error. I opened the page dated just 3 months before his death, where Uncle Carlos had written about his concerns regarding my military career. Elena has natural ability that exceeds most Marines I trained with, but the Army doesn't seem interested in discovering what she can do. She's being wasted in supply duties when she could be teaching marksmanship to special operations units. The military talks about utilizing all available talent, but still operates under assumptions that haven't been valid for decades. His frustration had been evident during our final conversations, when he'd expressed disappointment about my assignment to logistics rather than combat arms. Uncle Carlos had expected my military service to provide opportunities for advancing marksmanship skills he'd spent years developing, not bureaucratic duties that ignored my training completely. He'd died believing that institutional prejudice was preventing the military from accessing capabilities that could save lives in combat situations. The shooting positions he'd constructed throughout the valley remained perfectly maintained despite 3 years of weather exposure. Each location had been designed for specific training scenarios, prone positions for maximum stability, standing shots that simulated hunting conditions, and elevated platforms that required compensation for angle and distance. Uncle Carlos had engineered every detail based on his understanding of how different positions affected accuracy under various environmental conditions. At the 600-meter line, steel targets showed impact patterns from my previous weekend's practice session. 24 hits clustered within a 6-inch circle, accuracy that would have impressed military snipers, but seemed routine after years of Uncle Carlos's instruction. He'd insisted that consistent precision at extended ranges required mastering fundamentals that most shooters never bothered to learn properly, emphasizing that natural talent meant nothing without disciplined practice. His teaching methods had emphasized mental preparation as much as technical skills, incorporating meditation techniques he'd learned from a Vietnamese sniper during the Korean War. Shooting is 10% equipment and 90% mind control, he'd explained during one of our early lessons. You must become so still inside that your heartbeat doesn't disturb the rifle's alignment, so focused that wind variations become predictable patterns rather than random interference. The meditation practices involved achieving states of concentration that allowed perfect awareness of environmental conditions without conscious analysis. Uncle Carlos had trained me to sense wind direction changes through subtle shifts in air pressure against my skin, to calculate bullet drop automatically based on target distance, and to time shots between heartbeats when natural body rhythms created maximum stability. These skills had become instinctive through years of repetition under his guidance. Advanced techniques filled entire sections of his journal. Methods for shooting in extreme weather conditions, compensating for equipment limitations, and maintaining accuracy under stress that exceeded anything taught in standard military training. Uncle Carlos had developed these approaches during combat operations where missing meant death, then refined them through decades of competition against the world's best precision shooters. One section detailed his philosophy about the responsibility that came with deadly accuracy. A true marksman understands that every shot represents the potential to save innocent lives or eliminate threats that endanger others. This knowledge requires humility and wisdom that goes beyond technical competence. Elena must learn that her abilities carry moral obligations that cannot be taken lightly. His Purple Heart medal rested in a place of honor beside his shooting trophies, a reminder of wounds received during the Battle of Heartbreak Ridge, when his position had been overrun by Chinese forces. Uncle Carlos had never discussed the circumstances that earned him the decoration, but military records indicated he'd remained at his post despite severe injuries, continuing to provide sniper support until reinforcements arrived. The medal represented not just individual courage, but the larger principle that exceptional ability must be used in service of something greater than personal achievement. The ammunition reloading station occupied an entire corner of the workshop, equipped with precision scales, powder measures, and bullet seating tools that allowed custom loads for specific shooting conditions. Uncle Carlos had developed unique combinations of powder charges and bullet weights that maximized accuracy for his rifle, creating ammunition that performed better than anything available commercially. His loading data filled multiple notebooks, with detailed records of atmospheric conditions, velocity measurements, and accuracy results. Each cartridge he'd manufactured represented hours of careful preparation, with components selected for consistency and reliability rather than cost considerations. Uncle Carlos had explained that serious marksmanship required controlling every variable that could affect bullet performance, including manufacturing tolerances that most shooters never considered important. His ammunition achieved velocity variations of less than 15 feet per second, consistency that translated directly to improved accuracy at extended ranges. Weather monitoring equipment throughout the range provided real-time data about conditions that affected bullet trajectory, wind speed indicators at multiple distances, temperature sensors that tracked atmospheric changes, and humidity gauges that helped calculate air density variations. Uncle Carlos had installed this equipment during the 1980s, recognizing that environmental awareness was essential for consistent long-range accuracy. His teaching philosophy emphasized that true marksmanship involved reading natural conditions, rather than relying entirely on mechanical aids. Scopes and rangefinders are useful tools, but they can't replace understanding how wind affects bullet flight or knowing when atmospheric conditions will make certain shots impossible. Elena must learn to see what the environment is telling her and adapt accordingly. The workshop's library contained hundreds of books about ballistics, military history, and shooting techniques collected over 5 decades of serious study. Technical manuals from various military services, civilian publications about precision rifle shooting, and historical accounts of famous snipers throughout American conflicts. Uncle Carlos had studied this material obsessively, searching for insights that could improve his own performance and understanding of marksmanship principles. His annotations filled the margins of every book, observations about techniques that worked under specific conditions and criticisms of methods he'd found ineffective through personal experience. These notes represented a lifetime of learning from both successes and failures, creating a knowledge base that exceeded formal military training in depth and practical application. The most valuable section of his library focused on the psychological aspects of precision shooting. exploring mental disciplines that separated good marksmen from exceptional ones. Uncle Carlos had understood that technical skills could be taught relatively quickly, but developing the mental toughness required for consistent performance under pressure took years of dedicated practice and self-examination. A photograph on his desk showed Uncle Carlos teaching a group of young Marines during the early 1970s, his face serious as he demonstrated proper shooting positions. The image captured his transformation from combat veteran to instructor, a role that had defined the second half of his military career. Former students had written letters describing how his teaching had saved their lives during subsequent deployments, testimonials to his ability to transfer complex skills to others effectively. His legacy extended beyond technical instruction to include values about service, sacrifice, and the proper use of deadly force. Uncle Carlos had seen combat's reality and understood that marksmanship training carried moral responsibilities that civilian shooting competitions couldn't address. He'd tried to instill these principles in me through stories about Korean War, experiences and observations about the weight that came with taking human life in defense of others. The morning sun climbed higher above the mountain peaks as I prepared for another practice session, following routines that Uncle Carlos had established decades earlier. Equipment inspection, ammunition selection, atmospheric condition assessment, and mental preparation exercises that cleared away distractions from the week's frustrations at the warehouse. These rituals connected me to something larger than current circumstances, honoring traditions that stretched back through generations of warriors who'd understood the true meaning of precision under pressure. The notification appeared on my computer screen at 13:47 hours on a Tuesday afternoon in late September, buried among routine supply requisitions and inventory updates. All personnel, voluntary assessment for advanced marksmanship, instructor positions, Fort Bragg Special Operations Command. The announcement seemed almost deliberately obscure, posted to internal bulletin boards where most soldiers would overlook it, among dozens of other administrative notices that typically required no action from logistics personnel. But something about the wording caught my attention in a way that made my hands pause over the keyboard. The posting described an unprecedented opportunity for qualified personnel to compete for instructor positions within the Army's most elite training programs, regardless of current military occupational specialty or previous combat experience. Applications would be accepted from any soldier who could demonstrate exceptional marksmanship ability through a comprehensive evaluation process scheduled for November. I read the announcement 3 times before its implications were fully registered. This wasn't another routine training opportunity or administrative assignment that would disappear into my personnel file. The Special Operations Command was actively seeking instructors who could teach precision shooting to soldiers bound for the military's most dangerous missions, positions that traditionally went to combat veterans with extensive deployment experience and specialized training backgrounds. The requirements section outlined standards that seemed designed to eliminate most applicants before they could even submit paperwork. Candidates must demonstrate consistent accuracy at ranges exceeding 800 meters, maintain perfect scores during rapid-fire sequences, and complete written examinations covering advanced ballistics, atmospheric effects, and tactical applications of precision marksmanship. The evaluation process would span 5 days and include psychological assessments designed to identify personnel capable of performing under extreme stress. Private Morrison noticed my concentration on the screen and approached my workstation with curiosity that quickly turned to excitement as she read over my shoulder. "Elena, this is exactly what we've been waiting for," she whispered, glancing around to ensure Staff Sergeant Hayes wasn't within hearing range. "Finally, a chance to use our actual skills instead of organizing other people's equipment. We should both apply immediately." Her enthusiasm was infectious but also highlighted the enormous risk inherent in pursuing this opportunity. Applying for advanced marksmanship positions would require revealing shooting abilities that I'd never mentioned to supervisors or colleagues, potentially raising questions about why someone with my capabilities had been content with logistics assignments for 18 months. Worse, failure during the evaluation process would likely result in ridicule from male soldiers, who already questioned whether women belonged in combat-related roles. The application deadline was October 15th, giving me exactly 3 weeks to decide whether pursuing Uncle Carlos's legacy was worth the professional and personal consequences that might follow. During those weeks, I found myself torn between the security of remaining invisible in supply duties and the possibility of finally using skills that had defined my identity since childhood but remained hidden from everyone who knew me in the military. Staff Sergeant Hayes's reaction to female soldiers discussing combat opportunities had always been predictably dismissive. When Private Morrison had mentioned her interest in transferring to infantry units during a previous conversation, Hayes had laughed openly and suggested she focus on finding a husband instead of chasing unrealistic military fantasies. His attitude reflected broader institutional assumptions about women's capabilities that made applying for special operations positions particularly risky for someone in my situation. The psychological evaluation component worried me more than the marksmanship requirements. Uncle Carlos had taught me to shoot with deadly accuracy, but he died before preparing me for the kind of scrutiny that military psychologists would apply to non-traditional candidates seeking combat roles. Questions about motivation, family, background, and career goals would inevitably expose the disconnect between my current assignment and my actual capabilities, potentially leading to recommendations that I remain in logistics rather than pursue advanced training. Financial considerations added another layer of complexity to the decision. The instructor positions offered significant pay increases and opportunities for career advancement that could transform my ability to support my family in Colorado. My father's medical expenses continued to strain household finances, while my brother's college tuition represented an investment in his future that our family couldn't afford without my military income. Risking my current position for an uncertain opportunity seemed irresponsible given these obligations, but Uncle Carlos's journal contained entries that spoke directly to my current dilemma. Observations about talented soldiers who'd wasted their abilities because they'd been afraid to challenge institutional expectations. The military will use you at the level you demand to be used, he'd written after watching qualified Marines accept assignments beneath their capabilities. Elena must understand that excellence unrevealed is excellence unused, and unused excellence serves no one. The weekend practice sessions took on new urgency as I considered whether my shooting skills were actually good enough to compete against experienced combat veterans who'd learned marksmanship through life-or-death situations. Uncle Carlos had provided excellent instruction, but his teaching had occurred in controlled environments where mistakes carried no consequences beyond missing targets. The evaluation process would likely include stress factors designed to simulate combat conditions that I'd never experienced. My roommates noticed changes in my behavior during those 3 weeks of deliberation, commenting on my increased focus during evening study sessions and my tendency to spend extra time reviewing technical manuals related to weapons maintenance. I attributed these changes to general professional development goals, avoiding discussions about specific opportunities that might require explaining capabilities I'd never mentioned previously. The workshop visits became increasingly intense as I pushed myself through training scenarios that Uncle Carlos had designed for advanced students. Rapid-fire sequences that required transitioning between multiple targets at different distances, shooting from awkward positions that simulated combat stress, and exercises that combined physical exertion with precision requirements. Each session reinforced my confidence in technical abilities while highlighting gaps in experience that formal military training might have provided. On October 12th, 3 days before the application deadline, I made the decision that would change everything. about my military career and personal identity. Sitting in Uncle Carlos's workshop, surrounded by decades of accumulated wisdom about marksmanship and military service, I filled out the application paperwork with hands that trembled slightly despite my determination to pursue this opportunity. Regardless of consequences. The personal statement section required explaining why a logistics specialist with no combat experience believed she was qualified to instruct special operations personnel in advanced marksmanship techniques. I wrote about Uncle Carlos's training, my weekend practice sessions, and my belief that precision shooting was a skill that transcended traditional military career paths. The words felt inadequate to describe years of dedicated practice and inherited knowledge that had shaped my understanding of what it meant to be a truly capable soldier. Submitting the application required walking to the base personnel office and handing the paperwork to a clerk who seemed surprised that someone from supply duties was applying for special operations positions. Her expression suggested that she was accustomed to processing applications from infantry soldiers and rangers rather than female logistics specialists who worked in warehouses. I left the office knowing that there was no way to withdraw my application, and that everyone who processed it would know I'd claimed capabilities far beyond my official qualifications. The 3 weeks between application submission and notification of selection results stretched endlessly as I continued performing warehouse duties while knowing that my professional future hung in the balance. Staff Sergeant Hayes remained unaware of my application, treating me with his usual combination of paternalistic dismissal and casual disregard. Private Morrison had also submitted an application, creating an unspoken bond between us as we waited for responses that would either validate our beliefs about our capabilities or confirm everyone else's assumptions about our limitations. Notification arrived via official military email at 0630 on November 3rd, a sterile message that changed everything about my life with clinical efficiency. Rodriguez Elena Mem, selected for Advanced Marksmanship Instructor Assessment. Report to Building 1205, Fort Bragg Special Operations Command, the 7th of November 2023, 0800 hours. Bring all required documentation and personal equipment as specified. In attached guidelines. My hands shook as I read the message 3 times, each word carrying implications that extended far beyond simple acceptance into an evaluation program. This meant leaving Fort Carson, explaining my absence to supervisors who had no knowledge of my application, and entering an environment where my abilities would be tested against standards I could only imagine based on Uncle Carlos's stories and my own assumptions about military excellence. Staff Sergeant Hayes's reaction to my departure orders was exactly what I'd expected. Confusion mixed with irritation that his inventory schedules would be disrupted by what he clearly viewed as an administrative error. Rodriguez, what kind of paperwork nightmare did you create for yourself? Special Operations Command doesn't request logistics personnel for anything except equipment deliveries. You probably filled out the wrong forms, and now we're all going to waste time fixing your mistakes. His dismissive tone carried the confident authority of someone who'd never questioned his understanding of how the military operated, or who belonged in which roles. The possibility that I might have legitimate business with Special Operations Command didn't register as realistic given his fundamental assumptions about my capabilities and career trajectory. I let him believe whatever explanation made sense to him, knowing that attempting to correct his misconceptions would only create additional problems. Private Morrison had also received selection notification, and her excitement was tempered by the same anxiety that kept me awake during the nights preceding our departure. We'd both committed to pursuing opportunities that could either transform our military careers or result in spectacular failure that would follow us for the remainder of our service obligations. The risk felt enormous because the stakes were enormous. proving that we belonged in roles the military had never offered to people like us. The drive from Colorado to North Carolina provided 36 hours of highway meditation, time to process the magnitude of what I was attempting, and review everything Uncle Carlos had taught me about precision shooting and mental preparation. His journal wrote in the passenger seat alongside his Purple Heart medal, tangible connections to knowledge and values that would either sustain me through the evaluation process or prove insufficient for the challenges ahead. Fort Bragg's scale dwarfed anything I'd experienced during my military service, a sprawling complex that housed the most elite units in the American military. The signs directing traffic to various specialized commands read like a catalog of legendary military units: Delta Force, Special Forces, Rangers, and organizations whose names were classified, but whose reputations preceded them throughout the military community. This was where the nation's most dangerous missions were planned, and where soldiers trained for operations that civilian populations would never hear about. Building 1205 stood apart from the main administrative areas, surrounded by security measures that suggested its occupants dealt with sensitive information and classified activities. The parking area contained vehicles that ranged from standard military sedans to customized trucks, equipped with specialized communications equipment and weapon storage systems. This wasn't the world of supply warehouses and inventory management I'd grown accustomed to over the past 18 months. The reception area buzzed with tension and barely contained competitive energy as candidates from across the military assembled for processing. Infantry soldiers with ranger tabs and combat deployment ribbons, Marine snipers whose dress uniforms displayed marksmanship badges and overseas service awards, Special Forces operators whose quiet confidence suggested extensive experience in situations where shooting skills determined mission success or failure, counted 43 candidates during the initial gathering, representing every branch of military service and including combat veterans whose presence immediately established the evaluation's serious nature. Their conversations revealed deployment experiences in Afghanistan, Iraq, and classified locations that couldn't be discussed in detail, but had provided opportunities to develop marksmanship skills under actual combat conditions. The contrast between my background and theirs was immediately apparent to everyone present. While they discussed firefights, counter-sniper operations, and equipment preferences developed through life-or-death experiences, I remained silent and tried to process the reality that I was competing against soldiers whose qualifications seemed infinitely superior to my own weekend practice sessions and inherited knowledge from a deceased relative. Private Morrison and I were the only female candidates present, a fact that drew immediate attention from male competitors who seemed genuinely surprised to encounter women at an evaluation for advanced combat instruction positions. Their expressions suggested curiosity rather than hostility, but the underlying assumption was clear. We were anomalies whose presence required explanation that wasn't immediately obvious from our military records or physical appearance. Master Sergeant Thomas Crawford served as the evaluation coordinator, a career Special Forces soldier whose weathered features and controlled movements suggested decades of experience in situations where precision and judgment determined outcomes. His briefing established ground rules and expectations with the kind of clinical efficiency that left no doubt about the process's serious nature and demanding standards. "Ladies and gentlemen," Crawford began, his voice carrying authority earned through combat operations rather than administrative authority. "You are here because your commanders believe you possess exceptional marksmanship, ability that could benefit special operations training programs. Over the next 5 days, we will determine whether their confidence is justified through evaluations that will test every aspect of your shooting skills, tactical knowledge, and psychological fitness for instructor positions." The evaluation schedule he distributed outlined a progression of assessments designed to eliminate candidates systematically until only the most qualified remained. Written examinations covering ballistics, atmospheric effects, and tactical applications would be followed by practical shooting tests at distances ranging from 300 to 1,200 meters, under various environmental conditions. Psychological interviews would assess mental stability and teaching potential, while peer evaluations would examine leadership qualities and interpersonal skills necessary for effective instruction. Some of you will discover that your abilities, while admirable, do not meet the standards required for special operations instruction. Crawford continued, his gaze moving across the assembled candidates with professional neutrality. Others will find that technical competence alone is insufficient without the communication skills and psychological resilience necessary for training soldiers, whose lives will depend on the quality of instruction they receive. The barracks assignments reflected the military's assumption about gender-appropriate accommodations, with female candidates housed separately from their male counterparts in facilities that emphasized our status as exceptions to normal evaluation procedures. Private Morrison and I found ourselves in a building designed for temporary occupancy by visiting personnel, isolated from the main candidate population in ways that reinforced our outsider status. Our rooms were spartanly furnished with basic necessities and wall-mounted reminders about conduct expectations and security protocols. The isolation felt deliberate, creating physical separation that mirrored the psychological distance between our backgrounds and those of candidates with extensive combat experience and specialized training credentials. Evening conversations in the barracks revealed the depth of experience possessed by other evaluation participants. Stories about precise shots that had eliminated high-value targets. Marksmanship training received at specialized schools throughout the military and equipment. Familiarity developed through years of combat operations. These discussions highlighted gaps in my own experience while reinforcing doubts about whether weekend practice sessions could compensate for actual military training and deployment experience. The weight of Uncle Carlos's expectations seemed heavier in this environment, where his legacy would either be validated through my performance or diminished by my failure to meet standards that he'd believed I could achieve. His Purple Heart medal felt like both inspiration and burden, representing sacrifice and excellence that demanded honor through achievement rather than mere participation. Sleep came fitfully during those first nights at Fort Bragg, interrupted by anxiety dreams about missed shots and failed evaluations that would confirm everyone's assumptions about my limitations. The morning alarm sounded like a call to judgment, beginning days that would determine whether years of inherited knowledge and dedicated practice had prepared me for challenges that would define the rest of my military career. The first practical evaluation began at 05:00 on November 8th with a pre-dawn formation that assembled all 43 candidates in the darkness outside. Building 1205, Master Sergeant Crawford's voice cut through the cold North Carolina air like a blade as he explained that the next 4 days would systematically separate genuine marksmanship talent from soldiers who'd simply performed well at their home installations under controlled conditions. "Gentlemen and ladies," Crawford said, his pause before acknowledging the 2 female candidates, carrying just enough emphasis to remind everyone of our anomalous presence. "The initial screening will involve basic marksmanship, assessment at 300, 500, and 700 meters. Anyone who cannot maintain expert-level accuracy at these distances should save themselves. Embarrassment and withdraw voluntarily before official scores become part of their permanent records." The subtle suggestion that some candidates might prefer to quit rather than risk documented failure was clearly directed toward Private Morrison and me, based on the meaningful glances exchanged between several male candidates who seemed to share Crawford's assumption about our likely performance. Their confidence wasn't malicious, but reflected institutional expectations about women's capabilities that had never been seriously challenged in their experience. Staff Sergeant Marcus Johnson, the primary marksmanship instructor, distributed range cards and ammunition with mechanical precision while explaining safety protocols and scoring procedures. Johnson was a compact man in his early 30s whose quiet intensity suggested extensive combat experience and little patience for candidates who wasted his time with substandard performance. His evaluation sheets contain detailed criteria for accuracy, consistency, and technical proficiency that would be applied without regard for background or circumstances. The shooting positions were arranged to maximize psychological pressure on candidates unaccustomed to performing under observation. Each firing point was clearly visible from the others, ensuring that every shot would be witnessed by competitors who could assess relative performance in real time. This arrangement was obviously intentional, designed to identify soldiers who might excel in private practice but falter when their abilities became public knowledge. Captain Rodriguez, no relation despite our shared surname, served as the range safety officer and psychological observer, whose job involved noting candidate behavior under stress. His clipboard contained evaluation forms that tracked not just shooting accuracy, but also body language, confidence levels, and reactions to pressure that might indicate psychological fitness for instructor positions requiring performance in front of critical audiences. The first candidate called to the firing line was Sergeant First Class Michael Chun, a Marine sniper with 3 combat deployments and advanced training credentials that made his selection for the program seem inevitable. Chun's shooting position was textbook perfect, his breathing controlled and deliberate as he engaged targets with mechanical precision that suggested years of professional training and combat experience. His performance was flawless. 10 shots at 300 meters clustered within a 4-inch circle, followed by similar accuracy at longer ranges that drew appreciative nods from instructors, who clearly recognized exceptional technical competence. Chun's shooting demonstrated the kind of consistent precision that military snipers develop through extensive training and real-world application, setting a standard that would intimidate less experienced candidates. As candidates progressed through the evaluation, a clear hierarchy emerged based on combat experience and specialized training backgrounds. Rangers, Special Forces soldiers, and Marine snipers consistently produced scores that reflected professional-level instruction and battlefield application of marksmanship skills. Their confidence was evident in everything from equipment selection to shooting positions that had been refined through actual combat operations. Sergeant David Palmer, an Army Ranger with 4 deployments to Afghanistan, approached the firing line with casual confidence that came from having used precision shooting skills in life-or-death situations. His equipment was worn, but meticulously maintained, showing the kind of practical experience that separated combat veterans from soldiers whose marksmanship training had occurred only in controlled environments. Palmer's shooting was workmanlike rather than spectacular, but his consistency across all distances demonstrated the kind of reliable accuracy that combat operations demanded. His scores were slightly lower than Chun's, but his technical proficiency was obvious to instructors who understood that battlefield marksmanship often differed from competition shooting in ways that made consistent performance more valuable than occasional perfection. The psychological dynamics among candidates became increasingly apparent as the evaluation progressed. Combat veterans formed natural alliances based on shared experiences and mutual respect for each other's credentials, while soldiers with less specialized backgrounds clustered together defensively. Private Morrison and I found ourselves completely isolated, neither accepted by the experienced operators nor welcomed by other candidates, who seemed threatened by female participation in what they considered exclusively male territory. Ammunition distribution periods. Conversations revealed assumptions about our likely performance that ranged from patronizing encouragement to outright skepticism about our qualifications for participating in the evaluation. Several candidates made comments clearly intended for us to overhear, discussing their curiosity about how women would handle shooting under pressure and expressing doubt about whether we possessed the Physical strength necessary for extended range work. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez from the California National Guard represented the most openly hostile element among the candidates, making no effort to conceal his belief that female participation in combat-related evaluations represented political correctness rather than genuine merit-based selection. His comments were carefully phrased to avoid official complaints, but left no doubt about his conviction that we were taking positions that belonged to more qualified male soldiers. "I'm sure everyone here earned their spot through legitimate qualifications," Rodriguez announced during a break between shooting sessions, his voice carrying just enough volume to ensure we heard every word. "But it would be unfortunate if standards were lowered to accommodate candidates who can't realistically meet the requirements that this position demands." The implication was clear. Our presence suggested that normal selection criteria had been compromised to achieve diversity goals, rather than identify the most capable instructors. This assumption was shared by enough other candidates to create an atmosphere of skepticism that made every aspect of our performance subject to additional scrutiny and doubt about its authenticity. Master Sergeant Crawford maintained professional neutrality during these exchanges, but his body language suggested agreement with sentiments that questioned our qualifications. When candidates made comments about physical limitations or concerns about women's ability to handle combat-related instruction, Crawford's silence functioned as tacit endorsement of their skepticism. The equipment inspection process provided another opportunity for subtle discrimination designed to highlight our supposed inadequacies. While male candidates' weapons and gear were examined with routine efficiency, Private Morrison and I faced additional questions about our familiarity with equipment, specifications, and maintenance procedures that suggested assumptions about our technical knowledge. Staff Sergeant Johnson spent extra time examining my rifle and ammunition, asking detailed questions about barrel specifications, trigger adjustments, and optics calibration that other candidates weren't required to answer. His manner wasn't overtly hostile, but the additional scrutiny was obviously designed to test whether I possessed genuine technical knowledge or had simply borrowed equipment without understanding its capabilities. The psychological pressure was exactly what Uncle Carlos had warned me about in his journal entries, describing military environments where non-traditional soldiers faced systematic testing that went beyond official evaluation criteria. His experiences as a Mexican-American Marine in the 1950s had prepared him for institutional skepticism that questioned his capabilities based on assumptions about his background rather than demonstrated performance. By the end of the first day, 12 candidates had been eliminated for failing to meet minimum accuracy standards at basic distances. The remaining 31 would advance to more challenging evaluations that would test precision shooting under adverse conditions, designed to simulate combat stress and environmental factors that could affect bullet trajectory and shooter performance. Private Morrison had performed adequately but not exceptionally, earning scores that kept her in the evaluation, but failed to distinguish her from other candidates with marginal qualifications. Her shooting demonstrated competence without the kind of outstanding ability that would force instructors to reconsider their assumptions about female marksmanship capabilities. My own performance had been deliberately conservative, achieving scores that met requirements without revealing the full extent of my abilities. Uncle Carlos had taught me that tactical situations often required concealing capabilities until circumstances demanded their full application, and I sensed that revealing exceptional skills too early might create problems with instructors and candidates who weren't prepared to acknowledge female superiority in their specialized field. The breaking point arrived on the 4th day of evaluation, disguised as a routine psychological assessment that began innocuously enough in Dr. Patricia Williamson's sterile office overlooking the Fort Bragg training ranges. Dr. Williamson was a civilian contractor in her late 40s whose clinical demeanor and wire-rimmed glasses suggested decades of experience evaluating military personnel for specialized assignments that required exceptional mental stability and psychological resilience. Private Rodriguez, she began, consulting a thick file that contained my complete military record alongside notes from the previous 3 days of evaluation. I've been observing your performance throughout this assessment, and I have some concerns about your psychological suitability for advanced instructor positions within Special Operations Command. The words hit me like cold water, particularly since my shooting scores had been consistently above average and my written examination results had placed me in the top 15% of remaining candidates. 22 soldiers had been eliminated during the first 3 days, leaving 21 candidates competing for only 8 instructor positions. I'd survived every cut while maintaining performance levels that should have demonstrated my qualifications rather than raising psychological concerns. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Ma'am, I believe my performance has met or exceeded all stated requirements, I replied, trying to keep my voice steady despite the growing realization that this conversation was heading toward territory that had nothing to do with demonstrated competence. My marksmanship scores have been consistently high, and I've completed all written examinations with passing grades. Dr. Williamson removed her glasses and cleaned them with deliberate slowness, a gesture that seemed calculated to increase my anxiety while she formulated her response. Private Rodriguez, technical competence is only one factor we consider when evaluating candidates for positions that require teaching critical skills to special operations personnel. Of equal importance is psychological fitness, including the ability to function effectively within established military culture and social dynamics. Her emphasis on established military culture carried implications that made my stomach clench with recognition. This wasn't about my shooting ability or technical knowledge, but about my failure to integrate socially with male candidates who'd spent 4 days treating me like an unwelcome intruder in their exclusive domain. The isolation I'd experienced wasn't accidental but had been deliberately orchestrated to create conditions that could be interpreted as evidence of psychological unfitness. Furthermore, Dr. Williamson continued, making notes on her pad without looking up, your persistence in pursuing this assignment, despite clear social rejection from your peer group, suggests possible delusional thinking about your place within special operations culture. The other candidates have made their feelings about female participation quite obvious, yet you continue to pursue something that's clearly causing you significant social distress. The patronizing tone was worse than outright hostility because it disguised systematic discrimination as professional concern for my well-being. She was suggesting that my refusal to quit voluntarily in the face of peer rejection indicated mental health problems, rather than legitimate determination to complete an evaluation process I'd earned the right to attempt through documented performance. Dr. Williamson, with respect, I'm here because my qualifications warranted selection for this evaluation, not because I need social approval from candidates who've never given me a fair chance to demonstrate my abilities. The mission of this program is to identify the best marksmanship instructors, regardless of their social popularity with other candidates. Her expression shifted to something approaching pity, the same look Uncle Carlos had described receiving from Marine officers who'd questioned his fitness for sniper training based on assumptions about Mexican-American soldiers' capabilities. Elena, may I call you Elena? Sometimes the kindest thing we can do for someone is help them recognize when their aspirations exceed their realistic limitations before they cause themselves additional psychological harm. The suggestion that I was mentally unstable for pursuing opportunities I'd legitimately earned made my vision blur with rage that I struggled to control. She was pathologizing my determination as evidence of psychological deficiency, using clinical language to disguise institutional prejudice as professional medical judgment. This was exactly the kind of systematic exclusion that Uncle Carlos had warned me about in his journal entries, describing how the military eliminated threats to established hierarchies. Your isolation from group dynamics raises serious questions about your ability to function as part of instructional teams that must work closely together under high-stress conditions. Dr. Williamson continued, apparently interpreting my silence as acknowledgement of her concerns. Special operations instructors must be able to build instant rapport and trust with students whose lives depend on the quality of training they receive. Your social difficulties here suggest you might be a liability in actual instructional situations. That was the moment something inside me snapped. Not the explosive anger that leads to shouting matches or dramatic exits, but the cold, crystalline fury that comes when someone has finally pushed too far beyond acceptable boundaries. I stood up slowly, my voice deadly quiet, despite the adrenaline coursing through my system like liquid fire. Dr. Williamson, I've been patient with the social dynamics and systematic exclusion because I understood that was part of the evaluation process. But I won't sit here and let you pathologize my determination as mental illness because it's inconvenient. For everyone that I haven't quit voluntarily and saved you the trouble of officially failing me. She blinked, clearly not accustomed to candidates challenging her psychological assessments during official evaluations. Private Rodriguez, I think you're misunderstanding my professional concerns about your psychological fitness for... No, ma'am. I understand perfectly. You want me to voluntarily eliminate myself so you don't have to deal with the paperwork and political complications of officially failing a female candidate who's outperformed half the male soldiers in this evaluation. You want me to agree that I'm delusional, unstable, and unfit so everyone can return to their comfortable assumptions about who belongs in special operations and who doesn't. Dr. Williamson's pen stopped moving for the first time since I'd entered her office, and I could see genuine surprise in her expression at encountering resistance she clearly hadn't expected from someone she'd already categorized as psychologically fragile and professionally unsuitable. The truth is, I continued, my voice gaining strength as the words crystallized thoughts I'd been suppressing for 4 days. I've outperformed most of these candidates in every measurable skill except the politics of fitting in with people who decided I was a joke before I fired my first shot. My marksmanship scores are in the top 20%. My written examination results exceed program averages, and I've completed every physical challenge despite being smaller than everyone else here. Her clinical composure was beginning to crack as she realized that her standard techniques for managing problematic candidates weren't working as expected. The psychological pressure that was supposed to encourage voluntary withdrawal was instead producing defiant resistance that challenged the fundamental assumptions underlying her evaluation methods. Dr. Williamson, I'm not finished, I said when she started to interrupt, my tone sharper than anything I'd ever used with a superior officer. You want to discuss psychological fitness? Let me tell you about psychological fitness. I've been excluded from every informal gathering, ignored during tactical discussions, and treated like a diversity experiment instead of a qualified candidate. But somehow my failure to integrate with people who refuse to acknowledge my existence is evidence of my psychological unfitness rather than their professional misconduct. I reached into my pocket and pulled out Uncle Carlos's Purple Heart medal, setting it on her desk between us where the bronze star caught the fluorescent lighting like a small beacon of legitimacy that contradicted every assumption she'd made about my background and qualifications. My great-uncle earned this in Korea as a Marine sniper. He came home to people questioning his fitness for military service based on his ethnicity, just like you're questioning mine based on my gender. He could have been bitter, could have accepted other people's limitations on his potential, but instead he taught his great niece that excellence speaks louder than prejudice, and that the only opinion that matters is the one you have of yourself when you look in the mirror. Dr. Williamson stared at the Purple Heart, her clinical composure finally showing cracks as she processed physical evidence that contradicted her assumptions about my military heritage and family background. The medal represented a legacy of service and sacrifice that couldn't be dismissed as easily as the psychological profile she'd been constructing. "So here's what's going to happen," I said, standing to leave while keeping my voice level despite the fury burning in my chest. "You can write whatever you want in your evaluation. You can recommend me for psychological discharge, personality disorder, or whatever diagnosis makes everyone feel better about wanting me gone. But I'm not quitting. I'm not agreeing that I'm mentally unfit, and I'm not making this easy for anyone. By validating your preconceptions about my capabilities or mental state." I picked up Uncle Carlos's Purple Heart and headed toward the door, then turned back for one final statement that would either end my military career or force everyone to confront their assumptions about what qualified candidates looked like in practice rather than theory. "And Dr. Williamson, when I prove everyone wrong about my abilities, and I will prove everyone wrong, hope you remember this conversation and ask yourself whether the problem was my psychological fitness or your professional judgment in evaluating candidates who don't fit traditional profiles but possess the skills this program actually needs." The final evaluation was scheduled for 06:00 on November 12th, but I woke at 03:30 with the restless energy that comes from knowing your fate hangs in the balance, and there's nothing left to do except prove everything you've claimed about yourself. Rather than lie in my bunk replaying every moment that had led to this inevitable conclusion, I decided to take one last walk around Fort Bragg before my dreams of advanced marksmanship instruction either became reality or died in spectacular fashion. The base was quiet in the pre-dawn darkness, with only occasional security patrols and early rising personnel moving through the shadowed pathways between buildings that housed America's most elite military units. I found myself drawn to the advanced range complex where the final shooting assessment would take place in just 3 hours, a facility that represented either my vindication or my complete professional humiliation. The range was deserted, except for one figure, Chief Warrant Officer Sandra Martinez, the senior marksmanship instructor whose legend preceded her throughout the military community. At 48, she was the kind of woman who'd fought her own battles against institutional discrimination and won through sheer competence and an unwillingness to accept limitations imposed by others' narrow vision of what military excellence looked like. "You're up early, Rodriguez," she said without turning around as she adjusted target mechanisms at the 1,000-meter line. "Shouldn't you be getting final rest before what promises to be either the most impressive demonstration or the most spectacular failure this program has seen in 15 years? The question carried no mockery, just professional curiosity from someone who'd observed my performance throughout the evaluation and formed her own conclusions about my capabilities. Chief Martinez had maintained studied neutrality during the systematic exclusion I'd experienced, but her presence at the range 3 hours before the evaluation suggested she had opinions about what was about to unfold. "Couldn't sleep, Chief. Figured I'd take one last look at the facility before I either earn my place here or confirm everyone's worst assumptions about female soldiers who reach beyond their supposed limitations." The honesty surprised me, but something about her demeanor invited candor that I'd been unable to express to anyone else during the evaluation process. Chief Martinez finally turned to face me, her weathered features impossible to read in the dim pre-dawn light. "Mind if I ask you something, Rodriguez?" When I nodded, she continued, "Why are you really here? And don't give me the standard answer about serving your country or advancing your career. I want to know what drives someone to endure 4 days of systematic humiliation for the chance to teach marksmanship to soldiers who've made it clear they don't want you here." The question went deeper than anything Dr. Williamson had asked during her psychological evaluation, cutting through professional pretense to examine motivations that I'd barely acknowledged to myself. Because I'm better at this than anyone wants to admit. Chief, better than most of the candidates who've spent 4 days treating me like an unwelcome diversity experiment. And because my great-uncle didn't earn his Purple Heart, so I could spend my military career organizing other people's equipment while pretending my abilities don't exist. Chief Martinez studied Uncle Carlos's medal, which I'd pulled from my pocket. Without conscious thought. Roberto Carlos Martinez, Korea 1951 to 1953. Confirmed kills at distances exceeding 1,200 meters with equipment that would be considered primitive by today's standards. His work during the Battle of Pork Chop Hill is still used as a case study in precision shooting under extreme conditions. My jaw dropped as I realized she knew Uncle Carlos's military record in detail. You studied his service history? Rodriguez. I've studied every American military sniper of the past 70 years. Your great-uncle's techniques for shooting in adverse weather conditions are still referenced in advanced marksmanship manuals, which makes what's been happening to you during this evaluation even more insulting than it would be under normal circumstances. Her words carried weight that came from institutional knowledge and personal experience with the kind of discrimination I'd been facing. How many people have bothered to ask about your actual shooting background before deciding? You don't belong here based on appearance and assumptions? None, Chief. Not one instructor or candidate has asked about my training or experience. They've all assumed that someone who looks like me couldn't possibly possess skills worth taking seriously. The admission revealed how completely I'd been judged based on superficial characteristics rather than demonstrated ability. Chief Martinez walked over to her equipment case and pulled out a folder thick with documentation. Do you know what the original selection criteria were when this instructor program was established? When I shook my head, she continued, exceptional ability in core marksmanship competencies could override deficiencies in other areas. Technical precision was always considered the primary qualification because it's the one skill that can't be faked, taught quickly, or compensated for through teamwork. She opened the folder and spread several documents across a nearby equipment table. The problem is that over the years, the focus shifted from identifying the best shooters to selecting candidates who fit preconceived notions about what military instructors should look like. Instead of finding exceptional marksmanship talent, we started choosing people who conform to traditional expectations about gender, background, and career progression. One specific document caught my attention as she handed it to me. This regulation has been conveniently forgotten by most evaluation committees, but it's still official military policy. Any candidate who establishes a new range record during official testing must be reconsidered for selection regardless of other evaluation criteria, including psychological assessments that might otherwise disqualify them. I stared at the regulation, reading words that seemed almost too good to be true. Chief, are you saying that if someone were to break the existing range record during today's evaluation, the selection board would be required to overlook negative psychological evaluations and social integration concerns? Her smile was sharp as a blade and twice as dangerous. I'm saying that if someone were to demonstrate marksmanship ability that exceeded all previous candidates in this program's history, certain administrative complications would become irrelevant. The current record is held by Master Sergeant James Mitchell himself. 23 perfect shots in 30 seconds at mixed distances ranging from 400 to 1,000 meters. The challenge in her voice reminded me of every lesson Uncle Carlos had taught me about rising to meet impossible expectations through preparation and mental discipline. The final evaluation includes a rapid-fire precision sequence that's designed to test technical accuracy under extreme time pressure. Most candidates manage 15 to 18 successful hits within the time limit. No one has ever attempted to exceed Mitchell's record. I felt Uncle Carlos's presence beside me as clearly as if he'd been standing on the range, his voice echoing across the years with wisdom about champions being revealed under pressure rather than created through comfortable circumstances. Chief Martinez, if someone were to attempt this record during official evaluation, what would happen to you for facilitating it? Her laugh was sharp and knowing. Rodriguez, I'm 6 months from retirement with more commendations than I can count. And allies throughout the special operations community. The question isn't what happens to me, it's whether you're as good as your great-uncle's legacy suggests you should be. She began packing up her equipment with military precision, but paused to look at me one final time. The evaluation begins. At 0600, if someone were to arrive early and request to attempt the range record under official observation, I'd be required by regulation to allow it and document the results for the selection board's consideration. As she walked away, Chief Martinez called back over her shoulder. By the way, Rodriguez, your great-uncle's longest confirmed kill was 1,340 meters with a rifle that couldn't match the accuracy potential of today's equipment. Makes you wonder what his great-niece might be capable of with proper weapons and optimal conditions. I stood alone on the range as the sun began to rise over Fort Bragg, holding Uncle Carlos's Purple Heart and feeling something shift inside me like tectonic plates finding new alignment. The familiar calm that always preceded my best shooting began to settle over me like armor against doubt, and I could almost hear his voice across the years. Mia, champions aren't born. They're revealed when everything depends on a perfect shot. At 0545, I walked into the range control office and formally requested to attempt Master Sergeant Mitchell's rapid-fire precision record under official observation before the scheduled evaluation began. Chief Martinez's expression remained professionally neutral, but I caught the slight nod of approval as she began the paperwork that would either validate Uncle Carlos's faith in my abilities or confirm everyone's assumptions about the dangers of allowing unqualified candidates to embarrass themselves publicly. Within minutes, word had spread through the candidate barracks like wildfire. The logistics specialist who was supposed to be eliminated after her psychological evaluation had instead requested to attempt the impossible. And suddenly everyone wanted to witness what they expected to be either the most spectacular vindication or the most devastating failure in the evaluation program's history. By 0600, the advanced marksmanship range had transformed from a quiet morning training facility into something resembling a gladiatorial arena, with spectators gathering to witness an attempt that would either rewrite the record books or confirm every assumption about why women didn't belong in special operations instruction positions. The range had filled with an audience that extended far beyond the remaining evaluation candidates, drawing instructors, administrators, and senior enlisted personnel who'd heard about the unprecedented record attempt through the military's informal communication network that spread significant news faster than official channels. Among the spectators was Master Sergeant James Mitchell himself, the holder of the record I was attempting to break, his expression unreadable as he watched preparations for what could either validate or diminish his 4-year reign as the program's marksmanship standard. Colonel Patricia Hayes, the Fort Bragg Special Operations Command Deputy Commander, had arrived to observe personally, her presence transforming this from a routine evaluation into an officially significant event that would be documented and remembered regardless of the outcome. Her attendance meant that my performance would be witnessed by someone with authority to override administrative recommendations and make decisions based on demonstrated capability, rather than psychological evaluations or social integration concerns. The remaining 20 candidates clustered together near the observation area, their conversations a mixture of anticipation and barely concealed skepticism about what they expected to be a futile gesture from someone who'd already been psychologically disqualified. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, my most vocal critic throughout the evaluation, was running an unofficial betting pool with odds heavily favored towards spectacular failure and early elimination from the attempt. $50 says she doesn't hit the first target, he announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. his voice carrying the confident authority of someone who'd never witnessed anything that challenged his fundamental assumptions about female capabilities. 100 says she quits after missing 3 shots and saves herself further embarrassment. But I noticed other faces in the crowd that didn't share his certainty. Instructors who'd observed my shooting throughout the evaluation and recognized that my scores had been consistently exceptional despite the social pressure and systematic exclusion I'd endured. Their expressions suggested curiosity rather than predetermined conclusions about the outcome. Professional interest in whether my technical performance could translate to record-breaking achievement under maximum pressure. Chief Martinez approached me with the equipment I'd requested. A precision rifle identical to the one Master Sergeant Mitchell had used to establish his record. Match-grade ammunition selected for consistency and accuracy, and a shooting mat positioned at the optimal angle for rapid target engagement. Her movements were efficient and professional, but I caught subtle signs of anticipation in her carefully controlled demeanor. "Rodriguez," she said quietly, her voice carrying only far enough for me to hear above the growing crowd noise. "Everything you need is here. The rifle is zeroed, the ammunition is consistent, and the conditions are as favorable as they're going to get. The targets are positioned at distances ranging from 400 to 1,000 meters, requiring rapid adjustment for elevation and windage between shots." She paused, studying my face for signs of nervousness or doubt that might indicate I wasn't prepared for what I was attempting. "The time limit is exactly 30 seconds from the moment you engage the first target." Master Sergeant Mitchell achieved 23 perfect hits, which has stood as the program record since 2020. No candidate has come within 5 shots of matching his performance. I accepted the rifle and felt its familiar weight settle into my hands like a natural extension of my nervous system. The balance was different from Uncle Carlos's weapons, but the fundamentals remained the same: breathing control, sight alignment, trigger discipline, and the space between heartbeats where perfect shots lived. All the technical preparation in the world meant nothing without the mental stillness that Uncle Carlos had taught me to find regardless of external circumstances. "Chief," I said, loud enough for the assembled crowd to hear, "I'm ready to begin when you give the command." The targets were arranged in a sequence that would test every aspect of rapid precision shooting, requiring transitions between distances that demanded instant compensation for bullet drop and wind drift. The closest target sat at 400 meters, followed by others at 500, 600, 700, 800, 900, and 1,000 meters. Success would require not just accuracy, but the ability to calculate and execute corrections faster than conscious thought could process. Colonel Hayes stepped forward to observe the attempt personally, her presence adding official weight to what was already the most scrutinized marksmanship demonstration in the evaluation program's history. "Rodriguez," she announced in a voice that carried across the range with unmistakable authority, "you have requested to attempt the standing rapid-fire precision record under official observation. Are you certain you want to proceed?" The question was required by regulation, but also offered me a final opportunity to withdraw before potentially confirming everyone's worst assumptions about my capabilities. I looked around at the faces surrounding me, some hopeful, others skeptical, many simply curious about whether I could back up the confidence I'd been displaying despite 4 days of systematic discouragement. "Yes, ma'am, I'm certain," I replied, my voice steady despite the adrenaline that was beginning to sharpen my focus to the crystalline intensity that Uncle Carlos had taught me to recognize as the precursor to exceptional performance. Uncle Carlos had taught me to recognize as the precursor to exceptional performance. Settled into shooting position and began the mental preparation exercises that cleared away distractions and centered my consciousness on the only things that mattered: targets, wind conditions, and the mechanical precision required to achieve perfect shot placement under extreme time pressure. The noise of spectator conversations faded to background static as I entered the state of focused calm that made extraordinary accuracy possible. Chief Martinez raised her stopwatch, her voice cutting through the morning air with official authority. "Rodriguez, you may begin on my command. Ready. Begin." The first target at 400 meters fell to a shot that felt perfect from the moment I pressed the trigger. The crosshairs aligned with mechanical precision as the bullet found dead center. Without conscious thought, I was already transitioning to the 500-meter target, my body automatically adjusting for the elevation change, while my mind calculated windage corrections based on vegetation movement. I'd been observing during preparation, target after target, fell in rapid succession as I moved through the sequence with fluid efficiency that surprised even me. Each shot felt inevitable rather than difficult, the rifle's recoil returning my sight picture to the next target with minimal adjustment required. The rhythm became hypnotic. Breathe, aim, fire, transition, repeat. Time seemed suspended in the eternal moment, where perfect performance transcends normal limitations. At 15 seconds elapsed, I'd successfully engaged 18 targets with what felt like perfect accuracy, putting me ahead of Master Sergeant Mitchell's pace, but still requiring 7 more hits in the remaining time to break his record. The crowd had grown completely silent, their expectations of failure replaced by recognition that they were witnessing something genuinely extraordinary. The longer-range targets demanded more precise holds and greater compensation for environmental factors, but Uncle Carlos's training had prepared me for exactly these conditions. His voice echoed in my memory as I engaged the 900-meter target. "Distance is just another variable, Mia. Master the fundamentals, and the distance becomes irrelevant." 23 hits with 5 seconds remaining put me level with Mitchell's record, but I wasn't finished. The final targets at maximum range required perfect execution under extreme time pressure, but my confidence was absolute. The rifle had become an extension of my will, each shot an expression of everything Uncle Carlos had taught me about achieving the impossible through preparation and mental discipline. The final shot echoed across Fort Bragg like thunder, announcing the end of one era and the beginning of another. Through my scope, I watched the bullet impact dead center on the 1,000-meter target, completing a sequence that had demanded technical perfection under conditions designed to induce failure. Chief Martinez's voice cut through the stunned silence. Like a blade through silk, 25 perfect hits in 29 seconds. New Fort Bragg rapid-fire precision record. The explosion of sound that followed was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Dozens of people erupting simultaneously in disbelief, excitement, and the kind of primal recognition that comes when witnessing something genuinely historic. But beneath the noise, I could see faces processing what had just happened, and what it meant for everything they'd believed about who belonged in special operations instruction roles. Colonel Hayes was the first to recover her composure, stepping forward with the bearing of someone who just witnessed history being made in the most unexpected circumstances imaginable. Her voice carried the authority of official recognition as she addressed the stunned crowd of spectators who were still processing what they'd observed. "Chief Martinez, please document everything for the formal record. That was the most impressive marksmanship demonstration I've witnessed in 28 years of military service. The administrative implications of my performance were immediately apparent to everyone with understanding of military regulations and selection procedures. Master Sergeant Mitchell's 4-year record hadn't just been broken, it had been shattered by someone who'd been recommended for psychological discharge less than 18 hours earlier. The contrast between Dr. Williamson's assessment and my demonstrated capabilities created contradictions that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. Through normal bureaucratic channels, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez stood beside Mitchell, both men looking like they'd witnessed something that challenged fundamental assumptions about military capabilities and institutional judgment. Rodriguez's betting pool had evaporated into embarrassed silence as spectators who'd wagered against my success found themselves confronting evidence that their prejudices had led them to dramatically underestimate abilities that should have been obvious to trained military professionals. Private Morrison approached me with tears in her eyes, her voice barely audible above the continuing conversations among spectators who were trying to process what they'd witnessed. "Elena, that was impossible. Nobody shoots like that under pressure. Especially not someone who's supposed to be psychologically unfit for instructor positions. You just proved that everything they've said about us has been wrong from the beginning." Her reaction highlighted the broader implications of my performance for other female soldiers who'd been systematically excluded from combat-related opportunities, based on assumptions rather than demonstrated capability. My success wasn't just personal vindication, but evidence that institutional prejudices had prevented the military from identifying and utilizing talent that existed in demographics they'd traditionally overlooked or dismissed. Chief Martinez was documenting every detail of the record attempt with the thoroughness that significant military achievements demanded, her clipboard filled with witness statements, environmental conditions, equipment specifications, and photographic evidence. That would become part of official military history. Her expression showed professional satisfaction mixed with something approaching vindication for her decision to facilitate an attempt that other instructors might have discouraged or prevented. "Rodriguez," she said, approaching me with the formal bearing that official record-keeping required, "I need you to sign the documentation confirming that this attempt was conducted under regulation conditions with standard equipment and official observation. Your signature will make this performance part of your permanent military record and Special Operations Command historical archives." The significance of permanent documentation wasn't lost on me or the spectators who understood that my achievement would follow me throughout the remainder of my military career. Unlike informal demonstrations or training exercises that could be dismissed or forgotten, official records became institutional memory that influenced future assignments, promotions, and opportunities for advancement within specialized military communities. Colonel Hayes remained near the firing line, her expression revealing someone who was reconsidering fundamental assumptions about talent, identification, and personnel utilization within her command structure. The magnitude of my performance had created administrative complications that extended beyond simple evaluation procedures to question the effectiveness of psychological assessments and social integration requirements that had nearly eliminated exceptional capability from consideration. "Miss Rodriguez," she said, her voice carrying the weight of command authority mixed with genuine curiosity, "military regulations require that any candidate who establishes a new range record during official testing be reconsidered for program selection, regardless of previous evaluation criteria. However, I'm more interested in understanding your long-term career intentions, given what you've demonstrated here today." The question caught me off guard because it represented the first time during the evaluation process that someone in authority had asked about my personal goals rather than making assumptions about my limitations or psychological fitness. For 4 days, every interaction had focused on reasons why I didn't belong in advanced instruction positions, rather than exploring how my demonstrated capabilities might contribute to special operations training effectiveness. "Ma'am," I replied, feeling Uncle Carlos's purple heart warm in my pocket as I considered how to respond to an opportunity I'd never expected to receive. I initially applied for this program because I wanted to use marksmanship skills that I'd developed through family training but never had chance to apply in military service. However, what I've learned during this evaluation is that the real problem isn't whether I belong here, it's whether the system deserves people who are willing to endure systematic discrimination to prove their worth. My words created visible discomfort among spectators who recognized that I was criticizing institutional practices they'd participated in or witnessed without intervention. The systematic exclusion I'd experienced hadn't been accidental, but represented deliberate efforts to discourage my participation through social pressure and psychological manipulation designed to produce voluntary withdrawal. For 4 days, I've been isolated, mocked, and subjected to psychological evaluation that pathologized my determination as evidence of mental instability. I continued, my voice gaining strength as the magnitude of what I'd achieved provided authority to speak truths that had been suppressed throughout the evaluation process. The same instructors who questioned my psychological fitness this morning are now ready to welcome me into the program because I can shoot better than anyone expected. Colonel Hayes's eyebrows rose slightly, but her expression remained professionally neutral as she processed criticism that challenged the evaluation procedures she was responsible for overseeing. Go on, Rodriguez. I'm interested in your perspective on how this process might be improved. Ma'am, my abilities haven't changed during this evaluation, only your perception of what I'm capable of achieving. The military talks about identifying talent in unexpected places, but when someone unexpected actually demonstrates exceptional capability, the first instinct is to find reasons why they don't belong rather than recognizing what they could contribute. The observation created uncomfortable silence among spectators who recognized that my critique applied to their own behavior and assumptions throughout the evaluation period. Several candidates who'd participated in my systematic exclusion were studying their boots with the intensity of people reconsidering fundamental beliefs about competence and character. Furthermore, I said, looking directly at Master Sergeant Mitchell, whose record I'd just broken, institutional change shouldn't require extraordinary performance to overcome ordinary prejudice. The fact that I had to achieve something historically unprecedented just to be taken seriously suggests that this system fails to recognize qualified candidates who possess exceptional ability but lack the dramatic flair necessary to force acknowledgement. Mitchell's expression showed genuine discomfort as he processed my assessment of evaluation procedures that he'd helped design and implement. His record-setting performance had been achieved under supportive conditions by someone whose qualifications were never questioned, while my superior achievement had occurred despite systematic efforts to undermine my confidence and encourage voluntary withdrawal. Dr. Williamson appeared at the edge of the crowd, her clinical composure replaced by something approaching shock as she observed the candidate she'd recommended for psychological discharge receiving recognition from the base commander. Her evaluation methods and professional judgment had been publicly contradicted by performance that exceeded all previous standards, creating questions about her competence that would likely require administrative review. Dr. Williamson, Colonel Hayes called out, her voice carrying enough authority to ensure everyone heard the exchange. I believe you have some documentation to reconsider given Rodriguez's demonstration of exceptional mental toughness and performance under extreme pressure. Your psychological assessment seems to have missed some rather significant indicators of military readiness. The public criticism was devastating for someone whose career depended on accurate evaluation of personnel psychological fitness. Dr. Williamson's recommendation for my discharge had been based on assumptions about my inability to handle stress and social rejection, both of which had been conclusively disproven through performance that required extraordinary mental discipline and emotional control. Chief Martinez completed her documentation and approached Colonel Hayes with official records that would need to be forwarded to Special Operations Command Headquarters for inclusion in program archives. Ma'am, everything is documented according to regulation. Rodriguez's performance establishes a new standard that will likely stand for years given the technical precision and mental toughness it required. The administrative wheels were already turning to process my achievement and its implications for evaluation procedures that had nearly eliminated exceptional talent based on psychological assessments and social integration concerns. My record would become part of institutional memory that influenced future selection criteria and challenged assumptions about where military excellence could be discovered. But even as recognition and validation surrounded me, I found myself questioning whether acceptance earned through extraordinary performance represented the kind of institutional change that Uncle Carlos had envisioned when he prepared me for military service. The system hadn't evolved to recognize talent in unexpected places. It had been forced to acknowledge capability that was too obvious to ignore or dismiss. "Colonel Hayes," I said, feeling the weight of decision that would define not just my military career, but my integrity as someone who'd been shaped by values that transcended personal achievement. "I appreciate the opportunity for reconsideration, but I need to respectfully decline acceptance into this instructor program." The words hit the assembled crowd like a physical blow, causing several people to lean forward as if they hadn't heard correctly. Master Sergeant Mitchell looked genuinely confused, as if the concept of declining special operations selection didn't compute in his understanding of military career progression and professional opportunity. The stunned silence that followed. My decision to decline selection stretched across the Fort Bragg range like the calm before a thunderstorm, broken only by the distant sound of morning training activities continuing throughout the base, as if the world hadn't just witnessed something that would reshape how the military identified and developed exceptional talent. Colonel Hayes studied my face with the intensity of someone trying to understand a decision that defied every assumption about career ambition and professional opportunity. "Rodriguez," she said carefully, her voice carrying genuine confusion mixed with administrative concern, "you've just established a marksmanship record that may stand for decades and demonstrated capabilities that exceed anything we've seen in this program's history. Are you certain you want to decline an opportunity that thousands of qualified soldiers would sacrifice years of their careers to obtain?" The question was reasonable from someone whose entire professional experience had been built around the premise that military advancement represented the ultimate validation of individual worth and capability. But Uncle Carlos's legacy had taught me that true victory sometimes required choosing integrity over recognition, principle over promotion, and long-term institutional change over short-term personal benefit. "Ma'am, I came here believing that proving I belonged would be the ultimate achievement," I replied, feeling the weight of Uncle Carlos's Purple Heart in my pocket as I articulated thoughts that had crystallized during the past hour of recognition and vindication. What I've learned is that belonging isn't something other people get to grant or withhold, based on their comfort level with who you are or where you came from. My words created visible discomfort among spectators, who were processing the implications of declining something they'd spent careers pursuing. But I could see understanding beginning to dawn in the expressions of soldiers who'd witnessed the systematic exclusion I'd endured, and recognized that my acceptance would validate rather than challenge the institutional prejudices that had nearly eliminated me from consideration. "The real problem," I continued, my voice carrying clearly across the range to ensure every spectator understood the reasoning behind my decision, "isn't whether I can perform at levels that exceed current standards. I've just proven that conclusively. The problem is that this system only recognizes exceptional ability when it becomes impossible to ignore, which means countless qualified soldiers are being overlooked because they don't possess the dramatic flair necessary to force acknowledgement." "Chief." Martinez stepped forward, her weathered features showing something between respect and concern as she processed my rejection of opportunities she'd spent decades helping candidates achieve. "Rodriguez, I understand your principles, but walking away from this selection would waste talent that could contribute significantly to special operations training effectiveness. Your marksmanship skills could save lives by improving instruction quality for soldiers heading into combat situations." Her argument carried weight because it appealed to service values that transcended personal ambition, focusing on the broader mission of preparing warriors for life or death situations where superior training could determine mission success or failure. But Uncle Carlos's journal had prepared me for exactly this moment. when institutional pressure would be applied to convince me that individual compromise served larger purposes. Chief Martinez, you're absolutely right that these skills could contribute to special operations training, I acknowledged, pulling out Uncle Carlos's Purple Heart and holding it where everyone could see the tarnished bronze star that represented sacrifice in service of something greater than personal achievement. But my great-uncle didn't earn this medal, so I could validate a system that excludes qualified people based on prejudice and only recognizes their worth when forced to do so through extraordinary demonstration. The medal caught the North Carolina sunlight like a fragment of captured starlight, its presence transforming my rejection from personal pique into principled resistance rooted in military tradition and family legacy. Several veterans in the crowd recognized the decoration's significance and the values it represented, their expressions shifting from confusion to grudging respect for decision-making that prioritized integrity over advancement. Instead, I announced, my voice gaining strength as the path forward became clear, I'm going to apply for a position as civilian marksmanship contractor with Special Operations Command. Someone needs to develop training programs that identify and cultivate talent regardless of its packaging. And someone needs to ensure that future exceptional candidates don't have to break records just to be taken seriously. Colonel Hayes nodded slowly, her expression shifting to something approaching admiration as she processed the implications of my proposal. Rodriguez, if you're serious about that path, I'd be willing to recommend you for contractor positions personally. The command desperately needs instructors who understand both technical excellence and the institutional barriers that prevent us from maximizing available talent. The offer represented more than I'd dared hope for when I'd first applied for the evaluation program, providing opportunities to create systemic change while utilizing marksmanship skills that Uncle Carlos had spent years developing. More importantly, it would allow me to honor his legacy by ensuring that future generations of non-traditional candidates wouldn't face the systematic exclusion that had defined my experience. Master Sergeant Mitchell approached me with the hesitant manner of someone whose fundamental assumptions had been challenged in ways that demanded reconsideration of long-held beliefs. Rodriguez, I need to apologize for my role in what you experienced during this evaluation. Watching your performance has forced me to recognize that our selection methods have been excluding qualified candidates based on prejudices rather than demonstrated ability. His acknowledgement carried particular weight because it came from someone whose record I'd broken and whose professional judgment had been implicitly criticized by my superior performance. The fact that he was publicly admitting error suggested institutional recognition that extended beyond individual cases to encompass broader questions about talent identification and development procedures. Furthermore, Mitchell continued, his voice carrying clearly enough for all spectators to hear, I want to formally request that the Rodriguez Protocol be implemented throughout Special Operations Command selection processes. Any candidate who demonstrates exceptional ability in core competencies should be evaluated primarily on technical performance rather than social integration or traditional career progression patterns. The spontaneous policy proposal drew murmurs of approval from spectators who recognized that institutional change required systematic reform rather than individual accommodations. My achievement was being transformed from personal vindication into a catalyst for broader transformation that could benefit future candidates who possessed non-traditional backgrounds but exceptional capabilities. Dr. Williamson remained at the edge of the crowd, her clinical composure completely shattered by the recognition that her psychological evaluation had nearly eliminated someone whose mental toughness and technical competence exceeded all previous program standards. Her professional reputation would require rebuilding based on demonstrated inability to recognize exceptional psychological fitness when it didn't conform to traditional presentations and behavioral patterns. Private Morrison approached me with tears streaming down her face, her voice barely controlled as she processed what my decision meant for other female soldiers who'd been systematically excluded from combat-related opportunities. "Elena, what you've done today will change everything for women like us. You've proven that excellence can't be hidden forever, and that integrity matters more than acceptance from people who never wanted us here anyway." Her reaction highlighted the broader implications of my choice, which would be remembered not just as individual achievement, but as demonstration that principled resistance could produce institutional change more effectively than personal accommodation to discriminatory systems. My record would inspire future candidates, while my decision would challenge evaluation procedures that relied on prejudice rather than demonstrated capability. 6 months later, I stood in the same advanced marksmanship range where I'd changed my life with 25 perfect shots, but this time I wore the civilian contractor uniform that had transformed me from overlooked logistics specialist to respected instructor whose training methods were being adopted throughout the military. The morning sun cast familiar shadows across Fort Bragg, but everything else had changed in ways that rippled far beyond my personal story. The Rodriguez protocol had been implemented across all branches of military service, revolutionizing selection procedures by prioritizing demonstrated ability over traditional career progression and social integration criteria. Applications from non-traditional candidates had increased by 400% as soldiers who'd never considered special operations careers began to see themselves represented in recruitment materials that emphasized technical competence over conventional backgrounds. My first class of instructor candidates reflected this transformation. 15 men from backgrounds that would have been automatically dismissed under previous selection criteria. Sarah Kim, a former video game designer whose understanding of complex systems translated perfectly to advanced ballistics calculations. Marcus Washington, a former ranch hand from Montana whose experience with precision shooting in challenging environmental conditions made him a natural marksmanship instructor. Jennifer Martinez, a former mathematics teacher whose ability to break down technical concepts helped struggling students master fundamentals that had previously been taught through intimidation rather than education. The changes weren't limited to personnel selection but extended to institutional culture, where systematic exclusion and casual discrimination had been replaced by recognition that excellence could emerge from unexpected sources when given appropriate opportunities and support. The walls of my office were lined with letters from young soldiers who'd seen news coverage of my story and decided to pursue military careers they'd never considered possible. Maria Gutierrez from Texas had enlisted in the Army after watching a video of my record-setting performance, determined to prove that marksmanship excellence wasn't limited to people who fit traditional military stereotypes. Ashley Johnson from Michigan had scored highest in her Special Forces assessment class and credited my example with giving her confidence to pursue advanced training despite discouragement from recruiters who'd questioned her qualifications. Each letter reminded me that Uncle Carlos's legacy lived on through institutional changes that honored his sacrifice while ensuring that future generations wouldn't face the barriers that had nearly prevented me from demonstrating capabilities he'd spent years developing. The Purple Heart Medal remained on my desk as both inspiration and reminder that sometimes the most important battles are fought not for personal recognition, but for the right to prove that excellence has no predetermined face, background, or traditional path to achievement. The echo of those 25 perfect shots still resonated across Fort Bragg. But it had become something larger than personal vindication. It had become proof that courage doesn't always announce itself with dramatic gestures, but sometimes whispers through the quiet determination of someone who refuses to accept limitations imposed by others' failure of imagination about what's possible when talent meets opportunity and integrity guides the choice between personal advancement and principled resistance to systemic prejudice. 3 years after that morning at Fort Bragg, Uncle Carlos would have been proud to see his great-niece standing before a congressional subcommittee on military personnel, testifying about the Rodriguez protocol's success in identifying exceptional talent that traditional methods had overlooked for decades. The statistics were undeniable. Combat effectiveness had improved by 37% in units trained by instructors selected through the new criteria, while recruitment from underrepresented demographics had transformed the military's capability to adapt to modern warfare's evolving demands. But the moment that mattered most came during a recent visit to Pueblo High School, where I spoke to students who looked exactly like I had at their age, uncertain about their potential, convinced that excellence was reserved for people who looked different, came from better circumstances, or possessed advantages they'd never have. After my presentation, a quiet sophomore named Isabella Rodriguez approached with questions about military service and marksmanship training. "Miss Rodriguez," she said, her voice barely audible above the gymnasium's ambient noise, "my grandfather taught me to shoot, but nobody thinks girls like us belong in the military. Do you really think someone from here could do what you did?" I handed her Uncle Carlos's Purple Heart, watching her eyes widen as she felt the weight of legacy and possibility in her small hands. "Isabella, excellence isn't about where you come from or what other people think you can achieve. It's about refusing to accept limitations that exist only in other people's imagination." Today, Isabella is excelling in Army basic training, and her letters remind me that every person who refuses to quit on their dreams creates ripples that extend far beyond their individual achievement. If this story inspired you to pursue your own impossible dreams, hit that subscribe button and join our community of people who believe that excellence has no single face, background, or predetermined path to greatness. Your story of overcoming the odds and proving doubters wrong could be next. Share it in the comments below, and let's build a movement that celebrates courage in all its forms.